Security leaders we work with are constantly trying to find ways to help their teams operate more efficiently. And this is especially true for organizations who operate in areas around the world where consistent, reliable intel is hard to come by. In this scenario, you're stuck with either outsourcing this type of reporting where the information you're getting is less customized than it should be, or you're stuck burning a ton of cycles looking through Google and news articles and a bunch of disparate sources trying to paint a picture of the activity profile on the ground. Base operations customers are streamlining this approach through our global unrest data. And this looks like, in practice, as we drill down into Nairobi, what you see here on the screen. Nairobi is one of the primary business hubs in Africa, but is an area where consistent, reliable intel is historically hard to come by. So, what we see here as we drill down into the central business district of Nairobi is an increase in overall unrest activity over the last 12 months. We can see in the last 12 months, there's been a number of protests, both peaceful and violent, several riots, including mob violence and violent demonstrations, and a few instances of attacks on civilians. And in the last 6 months, we've seen about a 3x increase in this types of activity as compared to the previous three. Now, digging into the details here, we can see that recently, some of the activity that we see here is disrupted weapons use. So we see this one-off instance of police defusing an explosive in central Nairobi. As we dig through the data, this seems pretty rare over the last couple of years, but certainly something to keep an eye on if things like this keep popping up. Other than that, the activity has been largely peaceful, tied to protests for things like labor groups or civilians looking for peace during election time, things that might not present an immediate risk to people on the ground. But as you dig through this activity, what you find is about 10% of protest activity has a tendency to turn violent, and about 17% of overall protest activity requires some sort of intervention of some sort. So what this could mean is, while there's not an immediate risk of these peaceful protests that are going on, if people on the ground do encounter them, just to make sure that you're aware of the opportunity for these things to escalate based on historical patterns that we've seen. Now, looking at some of these other categories, we've seen some instances of attacks. As we dig in, what we find are most of these attacks are really interactions with police and someone who has been either accused or convicted of a crime. Not necessarily attacks on civilians. Some of the other examples we see are unidentified gunmen targeting specific individuals, like in this case, an environmental activist, not necessarily the randomized attacks throughout the city. The other thing we see a lot of is mob violence. But digging into the details here, we see most of this mob violence are tied to things like vigilante groups, where civilians are responding to a threat that they've seen on the ground. Maybe it's a robbery or some sort of assault, and coming together to stop the individual. So this is just one way that you can dig into data and have a nice, clean read on the details of what's been happening, with enough information to know how could this potentially affect my operations in that given area. With this information, it's all about making people more risk aware and putting yourself in a better position to avoid an incident to your people, assets, and operations. I hope you found this interesting. If you'd like to learn more and dig into some other areas, you know where to find us. Look forward to seeing you again soon.